Theodore. He's a tugboat and a friendly tugboat too. A friendly tugboat too. Oh, Theodore likes to do the things that friendly tugboats do. Pushing and a pulling in the great big harbor, in the great big world is so much fun. So many brand new things to discover. Waking with the sun, gotta get the job done. Oh, Theodore and Emily, Bodak, Hank and George, and the harbor master too.
The biggest barge the tugs had ever seen was coming to live in the big harbor. Theodore, George, and Hank were given the job of bringing him to his new dock. "Let's race!" shouted Theodore. He was very excited to see the new barge. The tugs set off for Bedford Buoy. "Can't catch me!" hollered Hank. "Can so!" called Theodore. "Here I come!" roared George. Well, of course, Hank won. "Hank," huffed Theodore all out of breath, "you're the fastest tug in the whole harbor."
You know, I really don't understand how Hank could even be considered the fastest tugboat. Wouldn't you think it would be the bigger tugs? Mainly George because of his double engines or something like that? It just doesn't make any sense how one of the smallest tugs could be faster than the rest. Then again, we do not have time to discuss this. The tugs were about to meet the new barge for the first time, and they couldn't believe how big he was.
"He's really big," boomed George. "He even has a big name," said Theodore. "Shelburne." "That's the biggest name I've ever heard," said Hank. Hank couldn't wait to be one of the first tugs in the big harbor to move the new barge. "Hello," George called to the barge. "I'm George, and this is Theodore." "Well, don't forget me," said Hank. I'm Hank." "Hello there, tugboats," replied Shelburne in a very slow voice. "My name is Shelburne the Sea Barge." "That's a really big name," said Hank. "Does anyone ever call you Shelley for short?" "Certainly not. My name is Shelburne the Sea Barge." Well, to Hank's surprise, Shelburne began moving. George and Theodore had tied their tow ropes onto Shelburne, and they were starting without him. "Hey!" called Hank. "Wait for me!" But George was vrooming his engine, and no one could hear Hank. The tugs puffed off with Shelburne, leaving Hank in a cloud of smoke. "Everyone always forgets about me," Hank said to himself.
So this was the episode that introduced Shelburne. That makes a lot more sense compared to his first two appearances with no explanation whatsoever. Also, Shelburne is not the biggest name those tugs have heard so far. Northumberland, anyone? Guysborough? Hello? Theodore? Did we just suddenly forget these? Whatever. So that night, the tugs couldn't stop talking about the new barge, especially with his big name. That convinced Hank that he should have a bigger sounding name, which became official the next day.
"I don't want to be called Hank anymore," replied Hank. "You don't?" said the dispatcher. No one calls Theodore Teddy," Hank continued. "Well, no, they don't," said the dispatcher. "From now on," concluded Hank, "I want to be called Henry." Well, all the tugs turned to Hank, and then back to the dispatcher. The dispatcher was very quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Very well, Henry."
Well, that's nice and all. I don't really see Hank being a Henry, which is funny, because isn't Hank a sort of nickname for Henry? Guess it sort of makes sense in a way. Well, the other tugs were all intrigued by Hank's new name, that they thought they should all have new names as well. That is, except for Theodore.
"You know," frowned George, "Henry is a much bigger sounding name than George." I think I should be called Goliath. I've always wanted to be called by my middle name, declared Emily. Annapolis. Fodak floated past on his regular safety inspection patrol. Hello there, called Philip the fairy twin. Fodak, called Fillmore the other fairy twin. I'm not Fodak anymore, called Fodak. Now, my new name is Frederick. Theodore, said Hank. What's your new name? Oh, I don't know, replied Theodore. I still like Theodore.
Well, at least Theodore is being calm and collective about this nonsense. Maybe he's just too polite to say that they're all acting silly over their new names. And besides, I like Theodore's name just as much as he does. Well, due to all the new names, the dispatcher was very confused and he kept getting them mixed up the following day.
Goliath, he began. I'm Frederick, said Fodak. He's Goliath. Frederick is a bigger name than Goliath, George grumbled under his breath. Continued the dispatcher, looking at Emily. Emily, you take Barrington. I'm Annapolis, explained Emily. And Barrington's name is Bartholomew, said Hank. Yes, said the dispatcher. I would like you, Goliath, to take Shelburne. I have now decided to be called Gargantua, announced George. Now, that was a really big name. Hank, Henry, Emily, The dispatcher was starting to get dizzy trying to remember all the new names. Annapolis, he sputtered, and, Frederick, Goliath, Gargantua, Galapagos, no, Gargling, oh, goodness. Everyone just go and do everything.
Well, that would drive anyone insane. Again, at least Theodore isn't buying into all the drama. All this fuss over new names is a bit much. Still funny, though, hearing the dispatcher spiral all over trying to remember everyone's new names. Well, now with all the confusion, he accidentally sent George, Emily, and Hank to move Barrington, and Theodore to move Shelburne.
Theodore tried to push Shelburne, but the barge barely budged. Theodore backed up and gave his mightiest shove. Shelburne started moving all right into the harbor. Whoa, called Theodore. Wait for me! Meanwhile, George, Emily, and Hank were trying to squeeze themselves around Barrington so they could pull him. But there wasn't much room. Emily, grunted George, push over! My name is Annapolis, replied Emily. You push over, George. It's Gargantua, huffed George. Barrington, hold still. I'm Bartholomew, said Barrington. This is silly, said Emily finally. Everyone just use their regular names.
3 tugs to move 1 barge. Now that's ridiculous. The fact that they're still disputing about their new names? Like, really? I can't even begin to imagine how Theodore managed to shove Shelburne despite how big and probably heavy he is. Well, now that everyone went back to their old names, other than Hank, they all suddenly realized that Shelburne was heading straight into the harbor. Everyone called for Hank, but the stubborn tug wouldn't move. So Theodore asked Hank to catch the barge, while using his new name.
Henry, he said, you've got to catch Shelburne. Well, Hank turned toward the runaway barge. He fired his engine, and then he began to race. Race just as fast as he could. Hank was fast, and soon he caught Shelburne. Now came the hard part. He lassoed his tow rope onto the barge, just like a horse, and began to pull. Pull with all his might. It worked. Hank stopped Shelburne, and just in time. The tugs all tooted their whistles and shouted, "Hooray! Hooray for Henry!" Well, that was exciting, said Shelburne.
And yet I still don't understand how Hank is the fastest. I mean, really, was Shelburne really going that fast? What confuses me even more is how Hank was even able to stop the big barge on his own. I mean, we just saw Theodore struggle just to give him a tiny push. And given the size of Shelburne, how the hell did Hank stop him? I don't know, something just really doesn't make sense here. So after all that, Hank then asked Theodore why he didn't even bother getting a new name. And it was because Theodore just felt like a Theodore. And then that convinced Hank to do some deep thinking about his new name. And he announced his decision the following day.
I've decided to have another new name, he announced. Another name? Said the dispatcher, already feeling dizzy. Yes, continued Hank. I've decided to be called Hank. You have? Said the dispatcher. Yes, concluded Hank. Hank is who I am, and Hank is who I want to be. You are? Said the dispatcher. I mean, of course you are. And with a hearty toot-toot, Hank set off for work. I'm really glad you're Hank again, said Theodore. Me too, Theodore, smiled Hank. Me too.
And that concludes Hank's new name. Look at that! Another Hank episode in a row. Just like the last episode, this was yet another funny one. While it might have been a pretty goofy concept for the Tugs to change their names, it was still really enjoyable. Having a bigger name doesn't exactly change who you are. Just being yourself is the best thing you can do, as Hank came to terms with in the end. I can sort of see where Hank is coming from with wanting to be noticed more, but again, changing your name doesn't really make all much the difference. On top of that, viewers are now properly introduced to Shelburne, which makes a lot more sense since this obviously took place before Harbour Fools and Hugs the Coast. All we can really go about him is he's slow. At everything. Not much really left to say. Music was again standard as always. The only real standout was Shelburne's slow theme, and visuals again consisted all around the Big Harbor. This may not be a top favorite of mine, but for what it is, it's still a pretty enjoyable episode. Next up is Theodore and the Northern Lights.